The first thing Eleanor Hart did after burying her father was check the water levels in the East Creek. She didn't cry at the graveside, not in front of the 50 or so ranchers and townspeople who had driven out from Riverton to pay their respects to Frank Hart. She stood in the Wyoming wind in her only black dress, holding her hat against her chest, listening to the minister read from Psalms, while the Wind River Range loomed gray and indifferent behind the headstones. She shook hands. She thanked people for coming. She accepted casseroles she would never eat and condolences she could not yet process. She watched them drive away down the long gravel road, taillights blinking red through the September dust. Then she walked to the east pasture alone and knelt at the edge of the creek. The water was low, dangerously low for mid-September. The creek should have been running clear and cold at this time of year, fed by the late summer snowmelt, working its way down through the limestone aquifer beneath the Wind River Range. Instead, it moved slowly, barely covering the stones the color of weak tea. She dug her fingers into the bank, and the soil came apart easily in her hand, pale and powdery, threaded through with the shallow roots of leafy spurge rather than the deep anchor roots of native fescue. She had been a large animal veterinarian for 7 years, 3 of which she had spent driving back and forth between Casper and this ranch, watching her father's lungs slowly fail. She had given up a partnership offer at a clinic in Denver to come home. She had told herself it was the right thing to do. Now Frank Hart was in the ground, and the right thing had left her with 5,800 acres of some of the most beautiful rangeland in Fremont County and a debt load that would have made a banker weep. She knew the number before she opened the ledger. $480,000 held by the First Cattlemen's Bank of Casper, secured against the land her great-grandfather had homesteaded in 1899. 3 years of declining beef prices, rising input costs, and the slow grinding expense of her father's medical care had eaten through the operating capital like rust through iron. The annual principal and interest payment was due the following September. She had 11 months and approximately no margin for error. She sat by the creek until the light failed, listening to the water move over the stones, thinking about numbers. Douglas Merritt found her the next morning. She heard his truck before she saw it, a spotless white 3/4 ton with the Triple Crown brand on the door, rolling up the ironstone driveway with the easy confidence of a man who owned everything around him and was accustomed to owning more. Merritt was 51 years old, wide through the shoulders, with silver hair he kept trimmed close and pale eyes that had never learned the habit of looking away first. He ran 12,000 acres south of Ironstone, the largest privately held ranch in Fremont County, and he had been her father's neighbor rival and occasionally his creditor for 30 years. He had also once been something else to Eleanor. She was 23 when he proposed to her in the parking lot of the Riverton livestock auction. She had been loading yearlings, her boots muddy, her hair tied back with a piece of baling twine. He was 40, recently divorced, and had apparently decided that Frank Hart's veterinarian daughter would make a suitable addition to the Triple Crown operation. He had not asked her what she wanted. He had told her in the calm, absolute way he told all his employees what they were going to do, that she would be well taken care of. She had loaded the last yearling, latched the trailer gate, and driven away without answering him. He had never forgiven her for it. She met him on the porch now, arms crossed, the coffee in her hand still steaming. "Eleanor." He took off his Stetson, a gesture of courtesy so practiced it had lost all meaning. "I'm sorry about Frank. He was a good man." He was. Merritt looked out over the ironstone yard, the aging hay barn, the squeeze chute that needed welding, the tractor with the cracked manifold Frank had been meaning to fix since spring. His gaze moved over it all with the quiet efficiency of a man appraising livestock. "I'd like to talk to you about the property," he said. "I know you would. I can give you a fair price, Eleanor. Better than fair. You walk away with enough to start clean somewhere. No debt, no worry, no." "No," she said. She said it simply, without heat, the way you close a gate. He looked at her, then the pale eyes steady and unreadable. "The agricultural credit market is in collapse. You know that. You're going to spend the next 12 months fighting a math problem that doesn't have a solution." He put his hat back on. "When you're ready to be reasonable, you know where to find me." She watched him drive away and stood on the porch for a long time afterward, holding the cooling coffee, looking at the land her great-grandfather had broken from raw prairie, and trying to feel certain she had made the right decision. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with her father's ledgers spread out under the single overhead light. Frank Hart had been a meticulous record keeper, and the records were damning in their precision. The Ironstone had been running 400 head of Angus on continuous grazing for 60 years, the same way his father had run it and his father before him. It had worked when grass was thick and beef prices climbed reliably and a man could borrow at 8%. None of those things were true anymore. The invasive weeds were the problem she kept returning to. Leafy spurge and cheatgrass had colonized roughly 30% of the pasture acreage. Her father had been spending $11,000 a year on chemical herbicide, and the weeds were still winning because the spray killed the spurge, but left the soil sterile, and sterile soil was exactly where spurge thrived best. It was a loop with no exit. Kill the weeds, sterilize the soil, provide ideal conditions for the weeds to return. Do it again next year. Pay for it again next year. She found the article in a manila folder tucked behind the 1984 tax returns. A photocopy of a rangeland ecology paper dated 1983 from a research station in New Zealand. Frank Hart had underlined passages in his precise small handwriting, the underlining careful and deliberate, the marks of a man who had read something carefully and was keeping it close. She poured herself a second cup of coffee and read it twice through, then a third time. Multi-species grazing. The intentional cohabitation of cattle and sheep on shared pasture, managed through frequent movement across small areas, creating the dense biological activity of a wild herd without the destructive concentration of continuous grazing. The paper cited studies showing that sheep with their split upper lips and browsing instinct would preferentially target the broadleaf invasives that cattle ignored entirely. The spurge that was bankrupting the Ironstone was to a sheep a meal. Furthermore, sheep and cattle carried no shared internal parasites. A sheep parasite ingested by a cow died in the cow's digestive system without reproducing, and vice versa. The combined hoofprint of two species moved frequently across the land in tight formation could rebuild soil structure through compaction and organic matter incorporation in a fraction of the time it would take any chemical or mechanical intervention. In New Zealand, this was considered progressive but unremarkable. In Wyoming, it was the equivalent of suggesting you invite rattlesnakes to a church picnic. The history of the American West was soaked in the blood of the sheep and cattle wars. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, cattlemen had slaughtered tens of thousands of sheep and killed dozens of shepherds across Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, claiming the hooved locust destroyed the range by eating the grass to the roots and leaving a scent that cattle refused to graze over. That prejudice had not died with the men who held it. It had been passed down generation to generation with the same unquestioning fidelity as the land itself. In Fremont County in 1987, running sheep on the same ground as cattle was not merely unconventional. It was an act of cultural war. Eleanor read the paper a fourth time. The science was not ambiguous. The ecological logic was sound in the way that things are sound when they are built on observation rather than assumption. She was a veterinarian. She understood ruminant biology. She understood soil ecology. She understood the difference between a principle that sounds reasonable and a principle that has been tested against reality and survived. She drove to Idaho 3 weeks later. The ewes she bought were Rambouillet crosses, 280 of them, heavy through the shoulders, and calm in temperament, better suited to co-grazing with cattle than the flightier Columbia breeds the New Zealand paper had referenced. She paid $12,000 she did not have secured against a microloan she had taken out using her mother's jewelry as collateral, a pearl necklace and a pair of gold earrings that had lived in the cedar box on her parents' dresser for as long as she could remember. She loaded the ewes into a rented cattle hauler at dawn and drove back across the state line with the windows down and the radio off, rehearsing what she was going to say to Walt Dunbar. Walt had been the Ironstone's foreman for 22 years. He had started working for Frank Hart the year Eleanor was born, and she had grown up thinking of him as something between a favorite uncle and a force of nature, a man who knew every inch of this land and every animal on it, whose opinion on ranching matters carried the weight of 2 decades of direct experience. He was 63 years old, had a bad knee from a cutting horse accident in 1979, and held views about sheep that were as fixed and permanent as the limestone ridges that framed the valley. She pulled into the ranch yard at 4 in the afternoon. Walt was at the squeeze chute, ear-tagging fall calves with the methodical efficiency of someone who has performed a task so many thousands of times that it has become a form of meditation. He stopped when he heard the trailer. He walked out to the gate slowly, favoring the bad knee, and looked at the animals inside, and did not speak for a long moment. The ewes looked back at him with the mild and curious gaze of creatures focused entirely on the immediate problem of feed and water. Walt, Eleanor began. No. He said it quietly without raising his voice, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. The weeds are taking 30% of our acreage. We can't afford the herbicide anymore. The paper I found shows that if we run the sheep through the paddocks with the cattle on a rotation, I don't care what the paper shows. Walt pulled off his work gloves and held them in his fist. She recognized the gesture. It was the gesture of a man removing himself from a situation, the same motion she had seen him make twice before in 22 years, both times when Frank Hart had made a decision Walt considered beyond the boundaries of good sense. I worked for your father on cattle, Eleanor. 22 years on cattle. I am not a sheep herder, and I will not be made into one, and I will not stand by while you run this operation into the ground on some idea you found in a foreign scientific paper. He looked at her directly, not with cruelty, but with the particular pain of a man who believes he is watching something he loves being destroyed by someone he respects. Your father would not have done this, he said. My father is gone, Eleanor said, and the ledgers are what's left. Walt set his gloves on the hood of the nearest truck with the careful deliberateness of a man making a final statement. Behind him, she could see that the other hands had stopped working. 4 men standing in the yard, dust watching. She looked at each of them in turn and understood before anyone moved what was about to happen. By sundown, the Ironstone Ranch had no employees. She stood in the yard in the falling dark alone on 5,800 acres, with 280 ewes in a temporary pen and 400 Angus cattle in the main pasture, and a silence so complete she could hear the creek moving over the stones in the north draw. $160,000 in livestock, nearly $5 million in land, and no one but herself to manage any of it. The silence lasted through the night and into the following morning. She fed the ewes from the hay trailer, checked the cattle water, walked the fence line to the south, came back and made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers again, and thought about what she was going to do next. She found Casey Briggs the following Saturday. She had driven into Riverton to post a help wanted notice at the feed store because she had no other options. The notice was handwritten on a piece of notebook paper and read, Ranch hand wanted, no experience required, room and board provided, minimum wage. She had written it in about 15 seconds and felt slightly absurd doing it because every experienced ranch hand in Fremont County already knew about the sheep, and the ones who didn't know about the sheep knew about Walt Dunbar's walkout, which was functionally the same information. The owner of the feed store, a practical woman named Shelley, who had been supplying the Ironstone since Eleanor was in high school, told her with the weary neutrality of someone who had already made peace with a strange situation that a young man had shown up 3 weeks ago looking for ranch work, had been sleeping in his truck in the parking lot until the overnight temperatures dropped into the 30s, and was now sleeping on a cot in the storeroom out of what Shelley described as basic human decency rather than any formal arrangement. Eleanor looked at the young man sleeping on the cot. He had the angular, hollow-cheeked look of someone who had not been eating regularly, and his hands, even in sleep, were half-closed fingers, slightly curled, the reflexive tension of a person bracing against the next thing that goes wrong. He was wearing a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times it had lost its color, and work boots that were good boots but needed resoling, and he looked about 19 years old. His name, Shelley told her, was Casey Briggs. He had driven west from Pittsburgh in a dying Subaru after his father's machine shop went bankrupt in the spring. He had been looking for ranch work since he crossed into Wyoming, but had no relevant experience, no references, and no clear plan beyond the vague conviction that the West was the kind of place where a person without options could find some. Casey, Eleanor said. He came awake immediately, sitting upright in the way that people sleep lightly when they are not certain of their safety. He looked at her in the fluorescent light of the storeroom, blinking, assessing. I need a ranch hand, she said. You'll start at 5 in the morning and work until the work is done. Minimum wage, 3 meals a day, and a room with heat. You won't know how to do most of what I ask you to do at first, and that's fine because I'll show you. The work is physical, and there is a great deal of it, and I cannot promise you any certainty about the long-term future of this operation. Casey looked at her for a moment with the direct, undecorated assessment of someone who has learned to evaluate situations quickly and without sentiment. When do I start? He said. She drove him back to the Ironstone that afternoon. On the road, she told him about the sheep, the debt, the walkout, and the ecological paper from New Zealand, explaining the logic of multi-species grazing in the same direct factual way she had explained medical procedures to livestock owners. She was not asking for his approval. She was giving him the information he would need to do the work. Casey asked practical questions. How many animals total? How much fencing would they need to move? What kind of water system did the paddocks require? How did you train a border collie to work two different species? He asked nothing about the cultural history of sheep and cattle in the American West because he had no cultural history of the American West to bring to the question. He was 19 years old and had grown up in Pittsburgh, watching his father cut metal, and had come west with the straightforward intention of learning something useful. The sheep were part of the work. He would learn the work. The first weeks were genuinely terrible. The integration of the ewes into the cattle pasture required a rotational grazing system, the same system described in the New Zealand paper, small paddocks created with temporary electric fencing, dense concentration of animals, frequent movement to fresh grass every 48 hours. The principle was sound. The execution was a sustained, exhausting disaster. The Angus cows, long accustomed to wandering thousands of acres at will, reacted to the confinement and the unfamiliar smell of sheep with the full theatrical outrage of animals that have never been meaningfully told no. They crashed through 3 sections of temporary electric fencing in the first week alone. The sheep, taking their behavioral cues from the panicking cattle, compacted into dense, immovable formations and declined to be moved by anything short of both border collies working at their absolute limit. Eleanor had 2 border collies, Fen and Sable. They were good dogs. They worked 18-hour days and showed no inclination to complain about it. Eleanor and Casey worked beside them. On the 12th day, pushing a reluctant group of Angus heifers through a gate in the temporary fencing, Casey caught a horn in the ribs. He went down hard in the mud, and Eleanor saw it happen, and by the time she reached him, he was already on his feet, pale under the sunburn, breathing carefully. "You need to stop," she said. "I'm fine," he said, and went back to work. She did not press it. She understood from the particular way he held himself for the rest of that afternoon that something had broken or cracked, and she understood equally that stopping was not something either of them could afford in the 3rd week of October, with the animals unsettled and the fencing system not yet established. She watched him work and filed it away. By the end of the first month, the paddock system was functioning. Not smoothly, not without daily crisis, but functioning. The animals had begun with the particular pragmatism of creatures focused entirely on food and water to tolerate each other's presence. The ewes grazed in the same paddock as the cattle without causing panic. The cattle moved through the temporary gates without crashing through them. The rhythm of the daily move, shifting the polywire perimeter to a fresh 5-acre section, began to feel less like organized chaos and more like a procedure. And in the paddocks that had already been grazed and given time to rest, something was beginning to happen in the soil. Eleanor knelt in the east paddock one evening in late October and dug her hand into the earth where 6 weeks earlier she had found pale, powdery dirt threaded with spurge roots. What came up now was different, darker. There was organic matter in it, trampled plant material that had been pressed into the surface by hundreds of hooves and had begun to decompose, binding the soil particles together, creating structure. There were earthworms in it working through the mulch layer. And despite the dry autumn, despite the lack of rain, the soil felt marginally cooler and marginally more cohesive than the bare ground 20 feet away where no animal had walked. She held it in her palm for a long moment and did not say anything. The mockery in town had settled into something consistent, that she navigated the way you navigate a headwind by reducing your profile and keeping your direction. When she walked into the cattleman's supply, conversation stopped. When she filled her truck at the gas station on the edge of town, she caught the phrase coming from a truck at the adjacent pump and drove away before she heard the rest of it. When she sat at the counter of the diner for a quick meal, she was aware of the attention, the way you are aware of weather as a background condition that required acknowledgement but not engagement. Douglas Merritt, she noticed, was never among the people laughing. He watched. He had the patience of a man who has learned that most problems resolve themselves if you give them enough time and maintain your position. In the 2nd week of June, she rode out to the south pasture in the early morning to check the fencing and found 80 sheep on the wrong side. The wire had been cut in 3 places, not broken by a deer or pulled loose by a weather-stressed post, but cut cleanly with something heavy and precise in the middle of straight runs where there was no mechanical reason for failure. The sheep had wandered through the gap and onto the Triple Crown's northernmost range, where they had been grazing contentedly on a section of Merritt's cheatgrass for what looked like several hours. She saddled her horse and rode to retrieve them and found Merritt waiting by his truck at the fence line as though he had been expecting her at approximately this time. He did not threaten the sheep. He looked at her with the measured calm of a man who has already made his next move and is not concerned about the one he is currently making. "I've filed a report with the Fremont County Animal Control Office," he said. "I observed behavioral irregularities in several of your animals over the past week that are consistent with early-stage scrapie. They'll be out to inspect within the week." She held her face still and looked at him. She knew exactly what scrapie was. She was a veterinarian. Scrapie was a fatal prion disease in sheep related to BSE in cattle. It was a reportable condition. A verified complaint of suspected scrapie triggered mandatory quarantine of the entire flock. No movement, no grazing integration with other animals, pending a full inspection and clearance process. Minimum 30 days. In the middle of a summer grazing season with her rotational system dependent on daily paddock moves, a 30-day quarantine would not merely inconvenience the operation. It would stop it entirely. 30 days of static concentration in one area would undo months of soil building work. It would also flag the account at the bank and give the board exactly the kind of documentation they would need if they wanted to accelerate the foreclosure timeline. Her ewes were not showing symptoms of scrapie. She had examined every animal in the flock within the past month as part of her regular health management. There was nothing wrong with them. She loaded her sheep without speaking to Merritt again and rode back to the Ironstone. That evening she sat on the porch and thought about the scrapie complaint for a long time. It was elegant in its way. No physical confrontation, no dramatic threats, just a piece of paper filed with a county office invoking a legitimate regulatory process, creating consequences that were entirely legal and entirely intentional. The county inspector arrived on a Tuesday, a state employee from Cheyenne, who spent 4 hours examining the flock with thoroughgoing professional care. He found nothing. The Ironstone ewes were healthy parasite loads within normal range, no behavioral or neurological indicators of any kind. His report was clear and his recommendation was clean, but the quarantine stood for 30 days pending official processing. Eleanor stood at the fence watching the idle sheep and counted the days. September 15th was the payment deadline. She had worked backward from that date 100 times in the ledgers. Every day of the rotation mattered. 30 days now in June, when the soil building work was most critical, was 30 days she could not get back. She went inside and got back to work. She drove into Riverton one afternoon while Casey was managing the afternoon water check and knocked on the door of a small law office in a converted Victorian on the main street. Diane Forsyth had been practicing agricultural and water law in Fremont County for 20 years. She was a thin woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the particular tiredness of someone who has spent 2 decades fighting large interests on behalf of small ones and has won enough of those fights to keep going, but lost enough of them to know exactly what things cost. She had sued Douglas Merritt in 1983 over an easement dispute involving the creek that ran along the Triple Crown's eastern boundary. She had lost narrowly on a procedural point that still visibly irritated her when it came up. She listened to Eleanor describe the scrapie complaint, the fence cutting, and the bank's acceleration clause without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, Forsyth was quiet for a moment, looking at the notepad where she had been writing things down. "The acceleration clause in your loan agreement," she said, "requires documented evidence of collateral value decline. It cannot be invoked simply because someone on the bank board disapproves of your management decisions." She looked up over her glasses. "Has anyone told you why Merritt wants your land specifically? He wants the acreage, the water rights that come with it. He wants the aquifer control," Forsyth said flatly and with precision. "Your 3 artesian springs are the primary recharge source for the Southern Wind River aquifer. In a normal water year, that's a background fact. In a drought year, it becomes a strategic asset. Merritt's wells are deep and old, and in a sustained drought, they run marginal. If he owns Ironstone, he controls the primary water allocation for 12 downstream properties. He can set access terms. He can reprioritize distribution." She set her pen down. "This has never been about the grass, Eleanor. It has never been about tradition or your father's memory or what the neighbors think about your sheep. It is about water, and Merritt has been working toward this for years." Eleanor drove back to the Ironstone in the late afternoon with the windows down. The Wind River Range was turning gold in the late light. She passed the Triple Crown fence line and looked at Merritt's pastures, the uniform pale color of continuously grazed range, the bare soil visible between the grass clumps, the absence of anything that could be described as biological complexity. She pulled off the county road at the Ironstone Gate and sat with the engine running for a moment. Water rights, the aquifer, 12 downstream ranches that depended on what moved through her ground. She had not known the full dimensions of what she was holding. She drove through the gate and went back to work. The quarantine lifted in the second week of August, the ewes officially cleared by the state veterinarian's office in a document that was so thorough and so unambiguous that it amounted to a quiet refutation of the original complaint. Merritt had made the report. The report had been investigated. The report was false. None of that was written in those words in the official documentation, but it was written in the structure of what the documentation contained and what it did not. Eleanor filed a copy with Forsyth. The 30 lost days had cost her, but the system recovered faster than she had expected. The paddock acreage that had been statically concentrated during the quarantine period showed stress, the grass overgrazed in places, the soil surface disturbed. She moved through that section quickly, giving it extended rest periods, and by mid-September the recovery was visible. The ground was darker and more cohesive than the surrounding land. The spurge that had been recolonizing during the quarantine had been browsed back to stumps. The system worked. It kept working even when she interrupted it. That mattered. The winter of 1987 arrived thin and cold and almost entirely without snow. Eleanor watched the weather reports through November and December with the focused, uneasy attention of a person reading a medical chart that is moving in a wrong direction. The Wind River Range snowpack, which normally accumulated through December and January and fed the valley's water table through the following June, was sitting at 35% of historical average by the time the new year arrived. The Farmer's Almanac had been predicting a dry year since October. The USDA regional forecasts were worse. Soil moisture across the state was already depleted from the dry fall, and what snow had fallen had come as light powder with low water content, the kind that blows off the ridges before it can consolidate. Eleanor increased the density of her paddock moves through December's smaller areas, more frequent shifts packing as much animal impact into the ground as possible before the freeze locked the surface. She was banking biological activity for the spring, pressing organic matter into the soil, building the sponge layer that the paper from New Zealand had described as the foundation of drought resilience. She could not control the snowpack. She could control what happened in the 6 inches of topsoil under her animal's hooves. Casey had settled into the work with the quiet efficiency of someone who has found a place where the demands of the situation match the structure of his attention. He woke before 5 every morning without being asked. He tracked the condition of the fencing system the way Eleanor tracked the soil, knowing which sections were stressed and which were sound, developing the specific observational vocabulary of a person who works the same ground every day until it stops being abstract. He was getting strong in the particular functional way of someone whose strength is built by work rather than exercise, and his hands had the cracked, competent look of hands that have found their purpose. He asked good questions, not many but good ones, and he listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone who understands that the information he is receiving has been earned rather than looked up. One evening in December, after the animals were settled and the temperature was dropping fast, he sat at the kitchen table across from Eleanor while she worked the paddock rotation schedule for the following week. He had a cup of coffee going cold in front of him and was looking at the notes she kept in the margin of the grazing plan. The soil observations, the weed pressure assessments, the moisture estimates. "You're mapping it," he said. "Every paddock." "Every paddock," she said. "Every move. If it works, I need to know why it works and where it works best. If it doesn't work, I need to know that before September." He was quiet for a moment. "My dad kept records like this," he said. "For the welds. Every batch of metal, every temperature, every setting. He said you can't improve what you can't measure." Eleanor looked up from the schedule. "Is that why the shop failed, because he stopped measuring?" Casey was quiet for a longer moment. "No," he said finally. "It failed because the plant that was buying the subassemblies moved to Mexico and the contracts disappeared in about 3 months. He measured everything perfectly right up until there was nothing left to measure." Eleanor looked at him. He was 20 years old and had driven west with no plan, and his father had done everything right, and it had not been enough, and he was sitting in a cold kitchen in Wyoming, helping someone else try to do everything right and hoping it would be enough this time. "We make September," she said. "That's the plan." He picked up his coffee. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Tom Whitfield drove up from Casper in the first week of May. The spring had arrived without rain. The creeks were running at 30% of normal flow. The South Draw had gone dry in April for the first time anyone at the Ironstone could remember. The meadows that should have been thick and green with the spring flush were pale and sparse, the native grasses struggling out of dormancy into a season that offered them almost nothing. Whitfield was the senior loan officer at First Cattlemen's Bank. He was a careful man in his mid-50s who wore his suits with the slightly apologetic air of someone who knows that his professional uniform creates a barrier and cannot figure out how to dress around it. He sat at Eleanor's kitchen table with the folder he had brought from Casper and drank the coffee she offered and looked at the table for a moment before he spoke. "The bank conducted a review in December," he said. "Your account is current. There's no issue with the payment record." He paused. "But the board has concerns about what they're calling collateral condition risk. The surrounding properties have declined in assessed value. The drought projections for this growing season are severe. There is a provision in your loan agreement that allows the bank to accelerate the foreclosure timeline if collateral value falls below a specified threshold." "I know what the provision says," Eleanor said. "There was a motion in December to invoke it. The motion did not pass." He looked at her directly. "I want you to understand the situation accurately, not alarmingly. The motion failed, but it will come back to the board in August if conditions deteriorate further." Eleanor looked at him. "Tell me what you're actually telling me, Tom." He was quiet for a moment, a careful man choosing careful words. "I'm telling you," he said, "that making the September payment is the cleanest resolution. It removes the question from the board's agenda entirely." He paused again. "I'm also telling you that the conditions being cited as collateral risk are conditions you cannot control. The drought is regional. The property value decline is regional. Your operation, from what I can see, is performing differently than the regional trend." He looked at the folder and closed it without opening it. "I'm not the whole board." He drove back to Casper an hour later, leaving a thin trail of dust on the county road. Casey was waiting at the barn. He had run the morning paddock move alone while Eleanor sat with Whitfield, and there was a wire cut across the back of his right hand that he had not bothered to wrap yet, and his shirt was soaked through from the work. "He coming to help or coming to foreclose?" Casey said. "He's watching," Eleanor said. "Same as Merritt." Casey nodded and looked at his hand and wiped it on his jeans. "The north pipe section is showing stress cracks. The sun's got the plastic. Wrap it with tape and check the pressure every 2 hours." "Already did." He paused. "Eleanor, I drove into Riverton 2 weeks ago, while you were at the county extension meeting." She waited. "I talked to Forsyth," he said. "On my own. I wanted to understand the water rights piece." He was looking at her with the directness that she had come to recognize in him, the look of someone who has thought carefully about whether to say a thing and has decided that not saying it is worse. "She told me about the aquifer, about the 12 ranches downstream, about what Merritt actually controls if he gets this property." "I know," Eleanor said. "I know you know." He paused. "Forsyth also told me she's been building a file. The scrapey complaint, the fence cutting the bank board motion. She says she has enough for a civil filing. Possibly more." He looked at her. "She's waiting to see if you want her to move." Eleanor was quiet, looking past him at the east pasture where the morning's paddock was coming alive with the sound of sheep and cattle moving through the new grass. "Merritt is going to keep finding levers," Casey said. "The scrapey complaint failed. The fence cutting didn't stop you. The bank motion didn't pass. He's running through the indirect approaches. What happens when he runs out?" It was the question she had been carrying since January without allowing herself to stop and look at it directly. She looked at it now. "We make September," she said. "If we make September with the loan current, Forsyth's file becomes a different kind of leverage than it is today." Casey nodded slowly. He picked up his gloves from the fence post. "The water," he said. "The north pipe section. I'll check it again at noon." He walked back toward the barn, and Eleanor stood at the gate watching the paddock and thought about everything at once: the soil and the bank and the water and the 12 ranches downstream and the thin gray line of smoke that was beginning to appear on the southern horizon. On hot afternoons, the leading edge of the fire season that everyone in the county was watching with a kind of quiet, helpless dread. July arrived like a verdict. The temperature records that summer would later be cited in range management literature on regional drought resilience. Day after day, the mercury at the Ironstone's outdoor thermometer reached 103, 104, 106 degrees. The sky had the pale, washed-out quality of something bleached by overexposure, a blue so attenuated it was almost white at the zenith, and the Yellowstone fires burning 300 miles north sent a permanent haze across the southern Wyoming sky that turned the late afternoons into something that looked like the end of the world. A bruised purple light that made the valley floor look like the surface of another planet and gave the shadows strange soft edges. On the Triple Crown, the continuous grazing strategy was failing, in the way Eleanor had watched it fail across the pages of her father's ledgers with a slow grinding, absolutely predictable inevitability. Merritt's Angus were thin. Not devastatingly thin, yet not in the visible crisis of late-stage malnutrition, but showing the first honest signs of a herd whose feed base is insufficient hip bones beginning to be visible. Coat quality, declining calves, nursing longer, and gaining less. The creek access points on the Triple Crown had been churned to bare mud through the spring and had dried to cracked gray clay by mid-June. The invasive cheatgrass had cured to a copper-colored mat that crackled underfoot like cellophane. His hay deliveries were coming 3 times a week now, the trucks laboring up the county road in the early morning heat, and Eleanor could see the economics of that without being told. Alfalfa was running 4 times its winter price. Diesel was high. The math was lethal in the same way her father's math had been lethal, but faster because a herd that has eaten through its forage base is a herd that costs more every day you keep it alive. On the Ironstone, the battle was relentless and physical, and the land was holding. The rotational system had built something real beneath the surface, invisible from the road, but present and working. The paddocks grazed in May and June had recovered through the first rotation and were carrying animals through a second. The deep-rooted fescue that the sheep had protected from weed competition through the previous fall and winter was drawing moisture from layers of the soil profile that the surrounding rangeland could not access. The organic mulch layer was keeping the ground temperature 15 to 20 degrees cooler than the bare hard pan on the Triple Crown side of the fence. It was not lush. There was nothing lush about the Ironstone in the summer of 1988. But there was forage. There was biological activity. There was life in the ground. The water system was the other story entirely. Eleanor had run 3 miles of polyethylene pipe from the artesian well to the paddock circuit, connecting the system with float valves and pressure regulators to keep the temporary troughs filled as the herd moved. In the July heat, the black pipe lying on the ground surface absorbed enough solar radiation to heat the water inside to near boiling, creating vapor locks that blocked the flow entirely. She and Casey spent significant portions of every day diagnosing and bleeding the system, burning their hands on the scalding plastic fittings, nursing the Honda pump through its daily cycle of overheating and recovery. Casey had rigged a shade structure over the most exposed southern section, using salvaged corrugated roofing and fence posts, which reduced the vapor lock frequency by roughly half. He had also worked out a gravity feed arrangement for the lower paddocks using a 500-gallon tank on the flatbed truck, which reduced the pump's daily load and gave them a backup when the main line failed. These were the kinds of solutions that nobody had written down. They emerged from the specific granular reality of a problem worked on every day by 2 people who had no alternative but to solve it. One evening in the 3rd week of July, after the animals were settled and the pump secured and the fencing checked for the night, Casey sat on the tailgate of the truck with his back against the wheel well and looked at the paddocks in the last of the light. The sheep and cattle were moving together in the low dusk, their shapes blurring at the edges, 2 species that had every biological reason to be indifferent to each other and had found through sheer proximity and routine a working relationship. "My dad used to say the only way to know if a weld will hold is to put real weight on it," Casey said. Eleanor was sitting against the other wheel, well her boots off her feet in the truck bed. He was right. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. He was looking at the paddocks at the line where Ironstone ground met Triple Crown ground, where the grass was green and the grass was pale, and the line between them was as clear as if it had been drawn with a tool. "The weight is definitely on." "It's holding," Eleanor said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She looked at him. He had lost weight since May, the way you lose weight when the work is continuous and the heat does not relent. His hands were a record of the summer, cracked and scored with wire cuts and chemical burns from the pipe fittings, the knuckles thickened from the daily use of tools. He was 20 years old, and he had been doing the work of a full crew without complaint for 9 months. "How's the rib?" she said. "Fine." "Casey." A pause shorter this time than the ones before. I had it seen in Riverton last month. It healed correctly. There was some scar tissue, but nothing structural. She had not known he had gone to a doctor. She thought about that, the fact that he had managed his own medical situation without asking her for time or money or acknowledgement, had come back and kept working. You should have told me, she said. You had enough to track, he said simply. The sabotage came on the night of August 3rd. Casey found it at 3 in the morning. He had developed the habit of checking the pump at irregular hours, not from any instruction she had given him, but from the accumulated anxiety of a person who has learned through a long summer of near failures exactly what happens when you don't check. He rode the four-wheeler out to the well station through the pre-dawn dark, navigating by the vehicle's yellow beam, through the scrub sage and the smoke haze, and when he shut the engine down to listen for the pump, he heard nothing. Then he heard water running fast across dry ground. The main supply line had been cut. Not at a fitting, not at a stress point, not in any place where mechanical failure was plausible, but in the middle of a straight run of pipe 3 feet from the ground with something heavy and deliberate. The pipe ends were clean. The pump had run dry after the line failed and had over-revved and seized the rod, knocked through the block, the engine a total loss. 3 miles of pipe, 3 months of careful management, and the one irreplaceable piece of mechanical infrastructure standing between the herd and a Wyoming summer at 104 degrees. He rode back to the house and knocked on Eleanor's door. She came out in her barn coat and he told her in 4 sentences. He watched her face move through the information. Not panic. Eleanor Hart did not panic. But something that was worse than panic in its way, a kind of absolute stillness that was the face she wore when the situation had moved past the point where composure is a performance and become the point where it is simply survival. The canyon spring, she said. That's 3 miles through the brush. The animals have to drink today. It's a dead end, Eleanor. If a fire comes down, if they don't drink by noon, they die in the heat. She was already moving, pulling her jeans on, pushing her feet into her boots. We move them now before the sun comes up. Saddle the horses. Get the dogs. The drive through the dark took 2.5 hours. Fen and Sable worked the edges of the herd through the sagebrush and rock in the pre-dawn dark, keeping the cattle from scattering, moving the sheep through the narrow draws with the urgent, tireless focus of dogs that understand the stakes even when they have not been told what they are. The cattle were thirsty and agitated by the smoke in the air and moved badly, stopping and turning and requiring constant pressure. The sheep followed the cattle as they always did now, the behavioral integration that had taken months to establish and had become, in the end, simply the way things were. By the time the sun came up over the Wind River Range, they were half a mile from the canyon entrance, and the temperature was already climbing. Eleanor rode ahead to check the spring. Behind her, she could hear Casey's voice low and steady talking to the cattle the way she had seen him develop over the months, the particular tone that was not commanding but was consistent that the animals had learned to associate with forward movement and safety. She heard his breathing change at about the hour mark. He was favoring his left side. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who hadn't been watching him for 9 months would catch, but she caught it. She said nothing because there was nothing to say. The canyon was close. The spring was there. They pushed the last of the animals through the canyon mouth at 9:40 in the morning. The artesian spring filled a pool between the limestone walls 40 feet across, dark and cold, from the depth of the aquifer it drew from. The cattle waded in before anyone had to direct them, sinking to their hocks in the mud at the edges. The sheep crowded the shallower margins. The sound of 700 animals drinking in the enclosed canyon was enormous, a rushing, sucking sound that echoed off the rock walls like something alive. Eleanor dismounted at the water's edge and knelt and put her hands in the spring and held them there. The cold was a physical shock after the hours in the heat. Casey sat down on a flat rock 10 feet away and leaned his back against the limestone and closed his eyes. "Tell me how bad it is," Eleanor said without turning around. A pause. "I'm okay." "Casey." A longer pause. "I think the tissue around the old break has been inflamed for a while. Maybe 2 weeks. I should have said something sooner." He stopped. "I kept thinking it would settle on its own." "It didn't settle." "No." She stood and turned and looked at him. The hollow cheeks, the way his arm was pressed against his side, without him seeming to know he was doing it. The color of his skin in the canyon shade. "I'm calling Walt," she said. "Walt doesn't work here anymore." "I know when Walt left," she said. She walked to her horse and took the two-way radio from the saddlebag. It was an old military surplus unit she had found in her father's equipment barn, heavy and reliable and capable of reaching 5 miles on a clear day. She keyed the channel that Walt had used during his 22 years at the Ironstone and gave her position and the situation in a flat, factual voice and released the transmit key and waited. Static. Wind through the canyon mouth. The sound of the herd drinking. She waited. Walt's voice came back 2 minutes later. "I'll send someone," he said. Eleanor lowered the radio and looked at the sky above the canyon walls. The light had changed while they were moving the herd. The blue had gone wrong, deeper and more saturated than the pale drought sky, a purpling at the edges that she knew from 30 years of watching Wyoming weather build and break. She climbed onto the flat rock at the canyon rim and looked south. The thunderheads above the Triple Crown were enormous. Vertical columns of cumulonimbus boiling upward into the high atmosphere, anvil-shaped at the tops, dark at the base and brilliant white at the leading edges where they were still building. They were the kind of clouds that would have meant rain in a normal summer. In this summer, in this heat with the humidity at ground level hovering around 7% for 6 consecutive weeks, they meant something else entirely. She could see it in the structure of the virga, the gray curtain hanging beneath the cloud base, the precipitation that was falling from 30,000 feet and evaporating completely before it reached the ground, leaving nothing but a smear of gray against the purple sky and the electrical charge that had built up in the system, looking for somewhere to go. Dry lightning. "Casey," she said. He was already on his feet, looking at the same sky. The first bolt hit the Triple Crown ridge before she finished saying his name. A white branching instant there and gone like a crack appearing in a wall, and then the crack widened. Another bolt. 3 in rapid succession, each one striking the same overgrazed cheatgrass-covered slope above the Triple Crown's north range. Each one hitting the driest ground in the driest county in the driest summer in recent memory. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then the smoke came. A thin column at first, rising from the point of the first strike with deceptive calm, the way a candle looks harmless in a room that is already full of fuel. Then the column thickened. Then it became a wall. The wind that had been driving the dry front hit the fire at the same moment the fire found the cheatgrass mat, and the result was not a fire growing toward a fire, but an explosion, a sudden wholesale conversion of a hillside into combustion, a 10-foot wall of orange flame moving southeast with the speed of something mechanical rather than natural. Eleanor watched it for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she was on her horse. She rode hard, coming out of the canyon and turning east, the smoke thickening around her as she left the shelter of the limestone walls and entered the open range. The fire's sound was something she felt before she heard it, a low, deepening pressure in the chest, the sound of enormous volumes of air being consumed. The Triple Crown horses were screaming somewhere to the southwest. A section of the ranch's perimeter fence had already gone, the wooden post burning, the wire sagging and glowing. She reached the Ironstone's east pasture fence line at a gallop and pulled up hard. What she saw stopped her in a way she had not been stopped since the night Casey knocked on her door. The fire was at the boundary wire. It had consumed the Triple Crown's north slope in what looked like a matter of minutes. 30-foot crown fire, fed by the cheatgrass and the accumulated tinder of a decade of suppressed burning and continuous grazing that had left the ground covered in dead standing matter with no moisture to moderate it. It hit the barbed wire boundary at full intensity. And then it changed. The wall of flame crossed the property line onto ironstone ground and dropped. Not stopped, it did not stop, but it compressed inward, lost 15 feet of vertical reach in the span of 10 yards, fell from a roaring, wind-driven crown fire to a creeping, hissing ground fire that moved slowly and low, burning the tips of the fescue, but struggling to maintain the energy that had made it look 20 seconds ago like something nothing could stop. Eleanor sat her horse and did not move. She was a veterinarian. She understood biology. She had read the New Zealand paper 4 times and believed it intellectually, and tested it in practice, and documented the results in the pages of the grazing journal she kept on the kitchen table. She had believed it the way you believe something that your professional training tells you is sound. But there is a different kind of knowing, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind. And that kind only arrives when you are standing close enough to feel the heat and smell the smoke and watch the thing you spent 18 months building prove itself against the hardest test it will ever face. The sheep had eaten the ladder fuels. For 18 months, 280 Rambouillet ewes had moved through every paddock of the Ironstone's East Range on their systematic, unhurried circuit, and they had consumed every broadleaf weed, every low-growing shrub, every opportunistic invasive that would have caught a low flame and carried it upward into the wind. The spurge that would have burned like wax, the cheatgrass that would have torched like paper. The accumulated horizontal fuel load that turns a ground fire into a crown fire was simply not there because it had been eaten, systematically, thoroughly, by animals doing what animals do. And the soil, the fire hit the ironstone's mulch layer and the physics changed. 18 months of hooves pressing organic matter into the surface of microorganisms, building structure in the dark of roots growing down through the profile, to reach the subterranean water that the drought had not been able to touch, had created a surface that was even in the middle of the worst drought in 30 years, genuinely different from the bare hardpan across the fence. Not wet in any obvious way, not damp in any way that would satisfy someone looking for visible moisture, but wet enough. Wet enough that the fire encountered resistance where it had encountered none on the Triple Crown. Wet enough that the combustion equation lost one of its three essential terms. The fire crawled, it smoked heavily, and it burned what was directly in front of it, and it moved, but it moved at a pace that two people with hand tools and a water tank could address. Eleanor dismounted. She was pulling the Pulaski from her saddlebag when she heard the second engine. Walt Dunbar's truck came through the fence 20 feet to her right, not through the gate, but through the wire, the barbed strands snapping back as the bumper drove through. He had cut the wire at the post first. She had not heard him do it. He pulled up on the ironstone side and got out, and the two men with him got out, and they took the tools from the truck bed and walked to where Eleanor was standing and started working. Walt looked at the fire line. He looked at the ground on the ironstone side. He looked at the ground on the Triple Crown side, the gray ash and the pale cracked clay, and the absence of any moisture in anything. He picked up a shovel and worked beside her without speaking. They held the line for 2 hours. Behind them, the Triple Crown burned. The North Hay Barn went at the 90-minute mark, a structural collapse they heard, rather than saw a deep reverberant sound like a wave breaking against rock. The equipment shed on the ridge, the old wooden water tank that had been there since Merritt's father built it. The fire moved through the Triple Crown's north section without obstacle, without resistance, consuming everything that had been allowed to accumulate through decades of extractive use, and stopped at nothing because there was nothing capable of stopping it, and the only thing that stood between it and everything south was the barbed wire boundary where the Ironstone's management had built one paddock at a time, a different kind of ground. At the 2-hour mark, the wind died. It did not diminish gradually. It stopped with the abruptness of a door closing. The smoke began to rise vertically instead of moving laterally. The fire, losing its driving force, began to slow on its own. What had been a moving line became a series of isolated hotspots, manageable and specific, the kind of thing you walk up to with a shovel and address directly. Eleanor was working the southern corner of the east fence when she heard another engine. It came from the Triple Crown side, moving through the ash and the smoke at the pace of something that has no urgency left in it. A single truck, not one of the Triple Crown's fleet vehicles, but Merritt's personal truck, the white 3/4 ton, with the brand on the door, moving slowly across the burned ground. It stopped at the fence line, or what remained of the fence line, and Merritt got out alone. He looked like a man who had been in a fire. His jacket was scorched along one shoulder, and his face had the particular blankness of someone who has watched something irreplaceable burn and has not yet found the next thought. He stood at the wire and looked at the Ironstone's east pasture, the singed but living fescue, the soft ground, the manageable remnants of what had been an inferno 20 yards away. And then he looked at what was behind him. The north section of the Triple Crown was black. Not charred, not damaged black. Ash and cracked clay and the skeletal shapes of fence posts still smoldering, and the absence of everything that had been there before, the grass and the weeds, and the accumulated biomass of decades of mismanagement, all of it fuel, all of it gone. Eleanor walked to the fence and waited. He did not speak for a while. When he did, it was not what she had expected, because Merritt was a pragmatic man, and pragmatic men, when they have run out of indirect approaches, sometimes speak with a directness that is nearly indistinguishable from honesty. Forsyth filed a records request with the county sheriff this morning, he said, before the fire started. She's filed a fraud complaint with the bank regulatory office, and she's named me in a civil action related to the Scrapie report and the fence damage. He looked at the burned ground behind him and then at the living ground in front of him. She's thorough. Yes, Eleanor said. He looked at the soil at his feet, the ironstone side of the wire. He reached down and picked up a handful of earth the way she had done a dozen times herself, and he felt the weight of it and the cohesion of it and the cool that was in it even now. The scrapey report was fabricated, he said. He said it without visible emotion, a man stating a fact he has decided to stop concealing. I told the animal control officer there were symptoms I had not observed. I wanted the quarantine. A pause. The fence in June was done by my foreman. I did not give the order in explicit terms, but I knew what he intended, and I did not stop him. Another pause shorter. The waterline was not me. I want to be clear about that. I had someone watching your operation through the summer. He acted without my knowledge on the night of the 3rd. He is no longer employed. That is a careful distinction, Eleanor said. It is a true distinction, he said. I am not going to argue it to you. Forsyth will determine what the evidence supports. He met her eyes. I am here because I would rather deal with you directly than deal with everything that is coming through lawyers. Eleanor waited. I withdraw from the bank board conversation entirely, he said. I have influence there, and I have been using it, and I stop using it now. I file a corrective statement with Animal Control regarding the Scrapey report, which removes the basis of Forsyth's fraud complaint. I pay for the pump and the pipe damage directly within the week, not through insurance. In exchange, Forsyth's civil action goes away. He paused. If you withdraw the complaint, she has no client. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, at the silver hair gray with ash, at the pale eyes that were tired now in a way they had not been before, not the tiredness of hard work, but the tiredness of a long wrong direction. There is one more condition, she said. He waited. You have cattle, she said. I have grass and a system that produces it. Your animals go through the ironstone rotation under the same paddock management protocol that saved this pasture today. Walt manages the system. Your foreman learns it from Walt. Market rate for the grazing lease, same as any other commercial arrangement, paid quarterly in advance. He looked at the living ground and the dead ground and the fence between them. Market rate, he said. Market rate, she said. He put his hat back on. He got in his truck and drove south through the ash. Walt came to stand beside Eleanor after the truck was gone. He looked at the burned Triple Crown ground for a while. He looked at the ironstone ground. He reached down himself and picked up a handful of the dark, cohesive soil and held it in his palm the way Eleanor had held it that first evening back in October of 1987, when she had knelt in the east paddock and found that the earth was beginning to change. He set the soil back down carefully. Your father would have made him pay quarterly in advance, Walt said. Just like you did. Eleanor looked at him. He would not have done the sheep, Walt said, and the corner of his mouth moved. Frank Hart would never in his life have done the sheep, but the quarterly payment in advance. He nodded once. That's Frank. She was quiet for a moment. The smoke was lifting the light coming back into the valley at a lower angle, the late afternoon pressing gold through the haze. I needed you to stay, she said. That morning with the trailer, I needed you to stay. I know. He said it simply. I was wrong. I'm saying it now because I should have said it before. He picked up his shovel. The south corner still has a hot spot. She picked up hers and they walked toward it together. The ambulance had reached the canyon by the time Eleanor rode back. Casey was sitting on the flat rock at the spring entrance, arguing in the patient, reasonable way of someone who has decided on a position and is prepared to hold it with a paramedic who wanted him on a stretcher. He was refusing the stretcher with the same calm that he refused most things he found unnecessary. He accepted the IV line in his arm with the resigned tolerance of someone who understands that some arguments are not worth having. He watched Eleanor ride up. Animals are fine, he said before she could speak. Cattle are calm. Fen is exhausted but unhurt. Sable is in the spring up to her chest, and I didn't have the heart to make her move. How bad is the infection? Eleanor said. Treatable, the paramedic said with professional firmness. 2 weeks ago it would have been minor. Now it's significant. He needs IV antibiotics, and he needs to stay in Riverton until the infection markers come down, which will be a minimum of 4 days. Casey looked at the ground. You drive yourself to Riverton tomorrow, Eleanor said. You stay until they release you. I'll manage the move. You can't manage the move alone, he said. Walt is here, she said. Casey looked at her. He's staying. He hasn't said so in those words, Eleanor said. But he's still here after the fire, which means the same thing. Casey was quiet for a moment, looking at the spring where Sable was standing chest deep in the cold water with an expression of pure animal contentment. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Thank you," he said, "for coming back. You held the herd in a canyon all morning with a fever and a soft tissue infection," she said. "We're not keeping score." He almost smiled. It was the closest he usually got. September 15th arrived cold and clear, the kind of September morning that Wyoming produces after a brutal summer, as if in apology. The air transparent and sharp, the Wind River Range cutting the western sky with the precise saturated clarity of a landscape that has given up everything inessential. Eleanor drove to Casper alone. She had the grazing lease agreement fully executed with Merritt's signature dated August 9th. She had the certified check from Merritt's account cleared at the Riverton branch 3 days earlier, which she had verified by calling the branch directly. She had Forsyth's letter confirming the withdrawal of the civil action pending completion of the agreed terms. She had her soil documentation from 18 months of paddock records, the photographs taken at the same fence line positions every 2 weeks, the before and after visible in a sequence that required no interpretation. She had what she needed. The First Cattlemen's Bank boardroom had the same lemon polish smell, the same heavy air conditioning, the same portrait of the bank's founder hanging above the credenza in the particular way of portraits that are meant to establish the weight of institutional history. Tom Whitfield was at the head of the table. The board members were present. Harold Vance, the silver-haired one who had been the most vocal about the acceleration clause, was present, and he looked at the folder Eleanor set on the mahogany with the expression of a man recalibrating. Eleanor did not make a speech. She endorsed the certified check and slid it across the table. She set the Merritt lease agreement beside it. She said, "The loan is current. I'd like to discuss the criteria under which the acceleration clause can be invoked and the process for documenting improvements to collateral value through land management practice. I have 18 months of soil data that I believe is directly relevant to any assessment of this property's long-term value." Whitfield looked at the check. He looked at the lease. He looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who has watched a situation over a long period of time and is now watching it conclude in a way he had not been certain it would conclude. "I think that's a reasonable conversation," he said. Harold Vance wrote something on his notepad. He did not look up. Eleanor drove back to the Ironstone in the late afternoon with the windows down and the radio off. She pulled over at the gate where the driveway met the county road and got out and stood at the fence line for a while. The east pasture was singed along the northern edge, but fundamentally intact. The fescue was dry and dormant, but rooted, and the roots were what mattered, the deep anchor of a living system that had proven itself against drought and fire and would push again in the spring. The paddock infrastructure stood ready, the polywire catching the late light, the post plumb, and even in their rows. The cattle grazed the southern section heavy and calm, their condition visibly better than anything running on the Triple Crown surviving range. Merritt's first herd of cattle, 200 of his best Angus, were in the north paddock under Walt's management, beginning the rotational sequence that would carry them through the winter. From somewhere near the equipment shed came the sound of fence posts being driven. Clean, rhythmic blows, the kind made by someone who has learned the work correctly and is doing it without waste. Casey was back from Riverton. He had driven himself home the previous afternoon. Antibiotics completed the paramedics' discharge instructions in his shirt pocket and had appeared at the barn the following morning at 5, without announcement and without fanfare, and gone to work. She had not asked him how he felt. She had watched him move and made her own assessment, and the assessment was that he was fine in the way that people are fine when fine is the only available option, and they have decided to be it. She stood at the gate and looked at her land and let herself feel for the first time in 18 months something that was not urgency or calculation or the specific focused tension of a person who has been holding everything together by force of will for a very long time. It felt like breathing. The drought broke in the third week of October. It came as rain, not as a dramatic weather event, but as a gradual lowering of the ceiling, the mountains disappearing into cloud first, then the ridgelines, then the upper foothills, the sky descending until it sat just above the valley floor and began to fall. A slow, soaking, unhurried drizzle that arrived in the early morning and did not stop. It lasted 5 days. Eleanor and Casey sat on the covered porch of the ranch house on the second day wrapped in wool blankets, coffee in hand, and listened. The rhythmic percussion of rain on the tin roof was a sound so ordinary that its ordinariness was the thing that made it extraordinary. Ordinary water falling on ordinary ground. The most basic transaction between the sky and the earth, the one everything else depended on, restored after a summer that had seemed determined to demonstrate what the world looked like without it. Out in the north paddock, the combined herd stood in the rain with their heads down and their coats slick and dark, chewing contentedly. Merritt's Angus and Eleanor's Angus and the Rambouillet ewes, all in the same paddock behind the same single strand of electric wire, all practicing the same tolerance they had learned through sheer proximity and routine. Walt was somewhere in the east section checking the fence line with the methodical attention he gave to everything, the attention of a man who has returned to a responsibility and intends to take it seriously. On the Triple Crown's burned north section, the rain hit the ash-covered hardpan and sheeted off immediately, carrying the fragile surface layer of combustion residue down toward the creek in dark, silty rivulets. The creek below the Triple Crown ran dark for 2 days. Topsoil, the irreplaceable material that took decades to build and minutes to lose. On the ironstone, the rain disappeared into the earth. The mulch layer absorbed the kinetic energy of the falling drops, preventing the surface structure from shattering. The water moved down through the root network, slowly, gently following the channels that 18 months of animal hooves and biological activity had opened through the profile, and it did not appear in the creek. It went into the ground. It was stored in the subterranean system that Frank Hart's great-grandfather had farmed without knowing how it worked, and that Eleanor Hart had spent 18 months deliberately, scientifically, at considerable personal cost, teaching herself to manage. Not a drop ran off. Every ounce was captured. Walt came in from the fence line at dusk on the second day and stood on the porch and looked at the rain falling on the paddocks for a while. "Your father watched the rain the same way," he said, "like he was counting." "He was," Eleanor said. "He kept a rain gauge in the east paddock since 1961. Every measurement written in the back of the farm diary." "I know," Walt said. "I'm the one who read it to him the last 3 winters." His eyes were going. He was quiet for a moment. "He had underlined the New Zealand paper," Walt said. "I saw him do it. I thought it was the kind of thing he kept meaning to do something about and never did." Eleanor was quiet. "He kept meaning to do something about a lot of things," Walt said. "He ran out of time." He looked at her. "You didn't run out of time." He went inside to get his coffee. The winter of 1988 brought the snowpack back. Not dramatically, not in the record-breaking way that sometimes follows a drought year, as if in compensation, but sufficiently, the mountains accumulating their white weight through November and December and January. The aquifer recharging below the surface, the ironstone subterranean sponge replenishing at depth. By December, Merritt's cattle were gaining condition under the rotational system. The paddock moves were being managed by Walt, with the foreman from the Triple Crown, learning alongside, asking questions that were sometimes obvious and sometimes surprisingly incisive, working through the logic of the system, with the focused attention of someone who has watched an alternative approach produce results and has decided to understand why. Merritt himself came to the ironstone twice that winter. The first time to review the grazing records and discuss the spring rotation plan. He sat at the kitchen table in the same chair Tom Whitfield had sat in and looked at Eleanor's paddock documentation and asked questions that were practical and relevant, and showed that he had been thinking carefully about what he had seen on the day of the fire. He did not apologize. He did not revisit the summer's events or offer any statement about them. He dealt with the present situation, which was the only mode he had ever operated in, and in the present situation, he was paying market rate to use a system that worked, and learning as much as he could about how it worked. The second time he came in February, he brought a check for the second quarter's grazing lease paid in advance as the contract specified. He handed it to Eleanor at the door without coming inside. "Your sheep are eating the spurge on the north section," he said. "The section that burned." "That's what they do," she said. "The spurge was there before the fire," he said. "We sprayed it every year and it came back every year." He paused. "It's not coming back in the sections they've grazed." "No," Eleanor said. "It won't." He nodded once. He put his hat back on. He drove away down the county road. Casey's Subaru finally died in January, overheating fatally on the highway outside Riverton, on a day when the temperature was minus 12 degrees, and Eleanor drove out to get him in the ranch truck with the heater running at maximum, and did not say anything about the car, which had been held together by will and duct tape for longer than it had any right to be. He rode back to the ironstone in silence, looking at the frozen landscape through the passenger window, and she understood that he was thinking about Pittsburgh, about the machine shop, about his father, about the sequence of events that had brought him to a Wyoming highway in January without a vehicle and with everything he owned in a duffel bag in the back seat of a dying car. "The Ironstone has a truck you can use," she said. "The blue 3/4 ton. It runs." "I know it runs," he said. "I've been maintaining it." "I know you have," she said. "I'm telling you it's yours to use." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. She drove. By the following spring, the researchers came. A team from the University of Wyoming's Range Management Program drove out in April to look at what the fire line had preserved. They brought soil sampling equipment and moisture meters and cameras and the particular focused energy of scientists who have been told something unlikely and have driven 4 hours to see whether it is true. They stood at the boundary between the Ironstone and the Triple Crown's burned north section and photographed a line in the earth that required no interpretation. Dark living soil on one side and gray ash-covered hardpan on the other, the border of two different management philosophies, made physical, made absolute, made permanent in the record of what had burned and what had not. They wrote a paper about it. Eleanor was cited by name. The paddock system was documented in detail. The soil data she had been keeping since October of 1987 was incorporated into the analysis. The long, careful record of changes in organic matter content and moisture retention and weed pressure, the work of two people managing ground that nobody was watching and that therefore had to be watched by the people responsible for it. The paper circulated through the range management community with the quiet, accumulating momentum of ideas that have been proven rather than theorized. In May, Eleanor sold the first cohort of Ironstone ewe lambs. She had not posted a formal listing. The inquiries had come in through the winter from ranchers who had heard about the Ironstone at the Riverton feed store and the County Livestock Association meetings, and through the particular ranching communication network that operates through fence line conversations and early morning calls, and the slow aggregation of information that travels from neighbor to neighbor across the high plains. She had 12 deposits before the lambs were weaned and a waiting list for the following year's crop that she wrote in the back of the same farm diary where her father had recorded the rainfall since 1961. She told each rancher who came to pick up their animals the same thing she had told herself in the beginning. The sheep are not the system. The sheep are part of the system. You have to move them, every day or close to it. You have to change the way you see the grass from a product you harvest to a solar panel you manage. The more carefully you manage it, the more it produces. The less you manage it, the more it costs you. Some of them listened. Some of them thanked her and took the sheep home and ran them the way they ran everything else, statically, continuously, without the daily discipline of the paddock move. And in those cases, the system did not work. And those ranchers came back the following season with questions which she answered because the questions meant they were paying attention. The Ironstone ewe lambs became the foundation of what changed in Fremont County over the following decade. Not quickly, not uniformly. The kind of change that comes from proven results rather than ideology is a slow change moving from property to property through the accumulation of visible evidence and practical conversations rather than through advocacy or argument. It did not require Eleanor to persuade anyone. The results visible at the fence lines did the persuading. Walt Dunbar stayed. He managed the Ironstone's operation through the following years with the combination of deep local knowledge and earned respect for a system he had once sworn he would never touch. He learned the paddock rotation the way he had learned everything else he had ever mastered, by doing it until the doing was second nature. And he taught it with the particular authority of a man who has been wrong about something significant and has decided that being wrong changes nothing except the content of what you know. He traveled to the county grange meetings in the winters and answered questions from ranchers who had heard about the Ironstone and wanted to understand how it worked. He was not an advocate. He was a practitioner, which is more useful. The grazing lease with Merritt ran for its contracted 18 months and was renewed. The Triple Crown rebuilt its north section under the rotational protocol, the native grass, returning to burned acreage that had not supported anything but invasive weeds for 30 years. It was slow. It was not the dramatic reversal of the Ironstone's transformation, which had had the advantage of starting from a healthier baseline. It was a beginning which was the most that could honestly be said about it, and Merritt accepted that assessment without requiring it to be dressed up as something else. He and Eleanor did not become friends. They became neighbors in the older sense, people who share a boundary and a water source and a history of difficulty, and who have arrived through the particular education that difficulty provides at something that functions like respect and operates like honesty and serves the practical requirements of two operations that depend on the same ground. Casey Briggs stayed. In the fall of 1989, Eleanor offered him a partnership stake in the ewe flock, a percentage of the breeding animals, in the annual lamb crop in exchange for the previous 2 years of work. He accepted without making it a ceremony, which was how he did most things. He had arrived in Wyoming with nothing and had found in the specific difficulty of a desperate situation a place where the demands of the work matched the structure of what he was. He had learned to read soil the way Eleanor had learned to read animals, from the ground up through daily contact and close attention until the reading was no longer a skill, but simply a way of seeing. His father's machine shop was gone. His Pittsburgh was gone. The Ironstone was not the life he had planned for because he had not at 19 managed to form a plan that reached this far. It was the life that had offered itself to him in a feed store storeroom on a November morning when a woman he did not know had woken him up and told him the work was hard and the future uncertain and asked him when he could start. He had started. He had not stopped. Eleanor Hart spent the rest of her working life on the Ironstone. She rode the fence lines in the early mornings when the light came sideways through the Wind River Range and turned the fescue to copper and the soil to dark velvet and the mountains to something that looked like a painting of themselves. She rode them in the winters when the snow lay deep and the cattle moved slowly through the paddocks, their breath hanging in the cold air, and in the springs when the first green pushed through the mulch layer and the ewes came into their lambing season with the focused, ancient certainty of animals that have been doing this for longer than anyone can account for. She kept records, every paddock, every season, the soil documentation accumulating in the farm diaries beside her father's rainfall, records two different kinds of attention applied to the same ground across the decades. The old man's counting and the young woman's measuring a continuous record of what this piece of the earth was capable of when someone paid close enough attention. She had come home to bury her father and had found underneath the debt and the isolation and the 18 months of everything going wrong, something that Frank Hart had left her without knowing it was what he was leaving. Not the land itself, though. The land was what she had fought for. Not the animals, though the animals were what she had risked everything on. Something beneath those things in the dark living soil that her great-grandfather had broken from raw prairie, and that her father had managed, and that she had nearly lost and had saved, and had spent the rest of her life learning to understand. He had found the paper and underlined the passages and put it in a folder behind the tax returns, and he had not done anything with it because he ran out of time, and she had found it and done something with it because she had had no other choice, and the thing she had done with it had changed the ground she stood on, and the water beneath it, and the 12 ranches downstream that depended on what moved through her land, and eventually, in the slow accumulating way that real things change something larger than any of that. The land breathed. She had learned to breathe with it. That was the whole of it. That was enough.